from outer space. We actually don't know very much about most cities on the planet. Even for a city like this, that's it's probably founded around about 1000 AD. It's well occupied. You can clearly see its pattern. You can see areas that are very grey, which is built upon. You can see areas that are green inside the city. Cities are very, very interesting places in terms of the sheer variety of landscapes that they incorporate. But they're also extremely difficult to define. Typically, we define them using administrative units. So there, for example, is the boundary for Dublin City. It's only part of Dublin County, and parts of the city extend out in this part of the world and this part of the world. You can clearly see certain things here, like the airport, which is located in an area that used to be agriculture, but slowly but surely the city is going out toward it. You can clearly see areas that are white roof-topped here. Those are always warehouses. So you can see some of the organizational structure of the city. Just for completion, when you hear about Brexit and the backstop, that's what they're talking about. That line there was drawn in the country in 1920, and it separates out Northern Ireland, which is part of the United Kingdom, along with Scotland, Wales, and England, from this area here, which is the Republic of Ireland. So when they're talking about Brexit, England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland leave, and the big fight at the moment is what's going to happen to that border. Dublin has about 1 million people in it, and that's only if I went way outside the boundaries of the city to include all those people who actually work in the city. Best piece of geography ever invented. Google Earth. Sao Paulo was immense by comparison. The built-up area of Dublin is probably about maybe 200 square kilometres. The built-up area of Sao Paulo, which you can clearly see in this image, is well over 1,000 square kilometres. So physically they occupy different sizes. There's 20 million people thereabouts here. There's only 1 million people, 750,000 in Dublin. So they're different places, they occupy different planets. It's on the Tropic of Capricorn. Dublin's located 53 degrees north of the equator, a relatively cold planet. So they share certain things in common. The impermeable landscape, the incorporation of some green, but they share lots of differences also. Some of which are cultural, and some of which are based upon where they're located. Cities transform every single aspect of the planet, thoroughly, completely. Here's an example. We started talking about today in class. This is a very, very simple model of the city centre of Sao Paulo. I pulled out all the building footprints that are available freely online. And this simple program generates shadow patterns. I superimpose the buildings on top of the landscape of Sao Paulo. And for today is the day I ran it. Maybe I didn't. Sorry. If I can start again, apologies. I'll find it later, sorry. I don't have it on my machine. Let me start my talk. Right. So what I'm going to talk about briefly is urban climate science. And I want to show that to a considerable extent it actually matured into a fully developed science, and that it can be connected to global climate science. In other words, we might now be at the verge of having an understanding of climate at the scale of the entire planet, through the scale of regions all the way down to cities. Now, much of this understanding has only come about in the last 20 or 30 years, largely as a result of experimental work done in individual cities and developing an understanding of processes. I'll start with this picture here to show you the nature of urbanization. urbanization is often used in two very different ways. One is to talk about the number of people that are actually living inside the cities. So we talk about the population being urbanized. So the population of the planet is now considered to be urbanized. More than half of the population of the planet live in areas that we describe as cities. Another description of urbanization is landscape transformation. This amazing photograph was taken by this photographer here over Mexico City. It's a suburb. It shows a complete and utter transformation of the landscape. So every single unit there, imagine it is like an individual building, each with an occupant, each with its own demands for water, energy, food, materials, etc. All of them connected through a vast network that connects each of the individuals through piping systems, through electricity wires, etc. In other words, this is an entirely human construct, built by humans, and then at the same time, you know very little about most cities on the planet. I'm going to draw on three pieces of information. One is this one here, which is the IPCC Global Climate Change, which tells us about what's happening on the planet as a whole. By the way, in the fifth assessment report, there are no cities. Isn't that amazing? About 70% of all the greenhouse gas emissions that come off the planet come out of cities. Cities occupy less than 3% of the land area of the world. Cities only get mentioned, not in the science part, they only get mentioned in adaptation and mitigation. Part of the reason for this is because there was no infrastructure for putting the information for cities in here. To fill this gap, there's a group that's based upon Columbia University, one of whom is Christopher Small, who I think was here last year, and they produced a report specifically on climate change in cities. Here's the thing, it largely takes the information about global climate change and tries to figure out what the implication of it is for cities. There's nothing in here that's specifically about the climate in cities. And then a book that I was associated with, which is especially on the climate of cities. So if this represents top down, this represents bottom up. Trying to understand the climates that we occupy, that we live in, by understanding how cities are constructed and made. So I'm going to talk about the elements of creating a science like that. I'm going to pick out two examples because the big reason why people want to do urban climate science is because they want to change the nature of the climate experience. I'll pick out two examples. One is from Chicago, one is from New York. They're both put forward as models as to how we should be changing cities. This one here is from the City Hall in Chicago and argues that we can improve the climate of cities, provide more biodiversity, offer cooling systems by putting gardens onto rooftops. Now, I think that's not true, by the way. The reason it's not true is because the soil area is very thin. Birds don't fly tens of meters up into the atmosphere so they can settle here. So they're not really for biodiversity. Do they cool? Yes, they do, but they cool the roof. And I don't live in a roof, I live in the street. In other words, there's a poor link between the scale of the intervention and the nature of occupation of the city. Here's an alternative. Now, part of the reason, by the way, why rooftops are always picked is because they're relatively simple and they're often owned. And these two buildings here, the City Hall, these are public houses in New York, are owned by the city and therefore they can do what they want. Here they paint the rooftop white. It's a very, very effective way of reducing the energy load on this building here. Does it affect me on the ground? No, it does not. So, how do you put together a science? Well, you have to have observations. You have to have a framework of theories that you can put these observations together. You have to understand the processes. And you have to be able to simulate and predict. So they're the core elements of the actual science itself. The science is not complete, however, until you can communicate it. One of the big problems in urban climate science is that we've often been very, very poor in communicating its results. Why do I need to communicate it? Because I want to find out what is in New York that I can apply to Sao Paulo, what's in Sao Paulo that I can apply to Dublin. And the only way I can do that is if I understand the process and have a formal means of exchanging that knowledge. That means I must agree on the terms. So when someone says, oh, I live in a suburb, everybody in the room has to agree what a suburb is, otherwise we're not communicating. And one of the problems we've had in the past with regard to studying cities, we've described cities as urban, and then not cities as rural. But this is of no real value. If you go to Hong Kong, for example, there's no such thing as anything between high-rise, dense buildings and countryside. There's nothing in between. So a lot of the information we have for Europe can't be transferred to Hong Kong because it's a different city. And then I want to apply it, and I want to be able to evaluate it. So that's what we regard as complete science. I think we're pretty good here. I think we're getting better here. I think the information we have for application is minimal, and evaluation is terrible. So in other words, when we make changes to the city, we have no idea as to whether those changes have had any effect at all. So here's global scale climate change science, which essentially began in the 1970s, and through various iterations has gotten better and better. So the models that they have now are extremely complicated. What's missing from this description are cities. Largely because, as I said to you already, if I took all the cities in the world, and even if I took the most liberal use of urbanization, they would occupy less than 3% of the land area of the world. Less than 3%. In other words, they're too small. And as a consequence, they don't get included in the model. We include the emissions from the cities in the model, the greenhouse gases and large aerosols, but we do not include the actual physical cities themselves. So they're missing. This creates a bit of a problem when we're trying to understand what the effects is of climate changes on cities in the future. These are the observations that underpin it. Everybody knows this very well. It's the most famous environmental graph in the world. There's a planet breathing in and out. And there it is, slowly increasing. Well, over 400 parts per million in cities, it would easily get over 600, 700 parts per million in cities. This is how they describe what the outcome will be. They put everything in climate change science forward in terms of what they refer to as radiative forcing, which essentially is the amount of additional energy at the top of the troposphere. So they estimate the overall drivers here, you can see 2.29 and 1.25. Then they allocate each of those drivers sources. Far and away, it's CO2. Methane is important, from cows, vegetation, from marshlands. Landscape change is important, but primarily it's emissions of carbon dioxide. Of course, we don't know the future. It's a very peculiar science. If we actually act on the science, then this future won't happen. The way they do it is they generate what they refer to as representative concentration pathways, depending on the route the plant takes. So you can see that envelope there describes all possible future outcomes in terms of temperature, and in this case here in terms of mean sea level rise. These are quite interesting too. These are two things that all climate scientists agree on, is the planet will get warmer. And here's the thing about cities. Cities are already warm, so you'll get additional warming on top of city warming. And the other thing you know is that most cities are located near sea level. That means that sea level rise will impact cities more than other places. In fact, if you saw the report today all on the international wires, it was about Kuala Lumpur being moved out of its current location to another location because they've taken so much water out of the system underneath the city is collapsing below sea level. So the solution they've taken is they simply removing the capital from the city of Kuala Lumpur and moving it to another place. Here is projections for the future. This is the best way I have of converting the impacts in the report back into impact for cities. Warmer and fewer or cold days and nights over most land areas. In other words, we can expect it to get warmer. Cities are already warm, so that means we can expect, the report seems to suggest this, that the effect of climate change on top of cities will be to enhance warming. Heat waves. Heat waves are already the biggest killer on the planet in terms of climatological drivers. So in North America, they calculate heat waves kill more people than tornadoes, hurricanes, earthquakes, whatever. Heat waves are the big killers. Heavy precipitation events, intense precipitation events, and of course that's the one thing we know about cities, is they're built of hard landscapes. They're not designed for heavy rainfall. If I look around this city here, that marvelous river, the Tieta, half of it has been turned into a massive gutter to try and remove the water off the system. And all along the side, you can see all the individual sewer systems all pumping water into it. All those systems are all built with regard to a particular climate, particularly intensity of rainfall. What happens when the intensity changes? I'm a big fan of this model here. I apply it all the time for urban climates. It's one of the best diagrams, I think, in the IPCC reports. It places risk at the intersection of hazard, vulnerability, and exposure. So, the hazard, for example, in a city might be heat waves. The exposure is you live in the city or so you're exposed to it, but not everybody's equally vulnerable. That means that the risk at the center of this must account for all these properties. Over on this side here, we have the socioeconomic processes, our decision making, our ability to actually adapt. On this side of the coin is the natural system, how it's changing. So this is easy enough to translate into urban climate science. So I said cities aren't even in the report, so what do they have to say about cities? Many global risks of climate change are concentrated in urban areas, and there's medium confidence in stating that. Steps that build resilience and enable sustainable development can accelerate successful climate change adaptation globally. Heat stress, extreme precipitation, inland and coastal flooding, landslides, air pollution, drought, and water scarcity pose risk in urban areas for people, assets, economy. In other words, it's a very generic statement. There's nothing there. I can't flip it over and say, okay, what's the implication for Sao Paulo? Because Sao Paulo doesn't exist in the report. They can't provide any information about this because it was never part of the science. So that's the top-down view. Here's the view from the other side of the coin. It starts out with you and me in my house with my car. It builds up from the house and the level which I occupy to the scale maybe of a neighborhood. And the neighborhood is the combination of houses that make up the particular area that I live in. And if I put those neighborhoods together, I get a city. I put those cities together, I get my region or nation. Eventually, I can build up all the way to the earth. That linkage is important because it tells me that decisions that are made at this scale here work up all the level, they get aggregated all the way to changing the system. But it also means that changes in the system work all the way back down and affect me. So what's the nature of cities? Well, every city is somewhat unique. Let me just pick out a few pictures here just to show you the different types of places the city occupies. This beautiful picture is from Vancouver, Canada. Okay, it's located on the Pacific Ocean. The Pacific Ocean has a cold water current running adjacent to it. So that means that sometimes it gets very low level breezes coming in, gets cooled by the water, and now you can see the city in the early morning has a radiation fog that fills up the entire city. So its climate is essentially driven by the background climate, which is the fact that it's located at about 50 degrees north next to a cold ocean. This is Mexico City. This is inversion. Mexico City will always have an air quality problem. Because essentially, if all cities generate wastes, then the only question is, does the atmosphere get rid of the wastes? But Mexico City can't get rid of the wastes because most of the time, after a nice clear night, high altitude, all the cold air pools up in the valley below. And it creates inversion. Any pollutants that go into the atmosphere get trapped below that level there. This is common for an awful lot of cities throughout the world. This is Los Angeles' air pollution problem. This is La Paz's, San Diego's pollution problem. They do sit inside existing systems. This is a massive dust storm, what they call a HABO, approaching Phoenix, Arizona. So in other words, that city happens to be located in a desert environment. So not surprisingly, on occasion, when you get winds, it picks up the dust and it gets natural air pollution simply because the air is pumped in from outside. This is about half of Beijing's problem. Beijing sits in a big bowl and causes its own pretty bad air quality, but Beijing is also close to a big desert. So it gets air pollution which is natural from the desert and self-created air pollution generated by its own activities. Of course, I don't have to tell you, this is Sao Paulo. Its natural environment, of course, is located in the jungle, or very close to being a jungle. So when there is a fire in the jungle and the conditions are right, the smoke simply gets ejected to another location. Now, typically, if the weather circumstances are right, this stuff will get mixed into the atmosphere, but all the low-level atmosphere, the wind patterns, etc., were perfect to actually deliver nighttime in the middle of the day to South Pole. So two things are linked. So I want to understand global climate change, and I want to modify global climate change. I do have to understand the kinds of cities, and I do have to intervene in the scale of a city. Here's a couple of maps that I think demonstrate how important cities are globally. On the top is population. So now it tells you a great deal about the future of the planet. You don't see too many cities in northern Siberia, and nor are you likely to see in the future. You don't see any cities in the desert areas of the world. Where you're starting to see more and more big cities is in the tropics. So here you see the major concentration of cities on the planet. Here is the CO2 emissions. Now these are industrial scale CO2 emissions. So you can see that many cities simply disappear off the map because they're impoverished. So Lagos doesn't really appear. What you're looking at a map is basically of unfairness. That's where the population is, but not all the population using the resources equally. Here you can see the big cities of the world and the consumption of CO2. So you can see, for example, Moscow shoots out, bitterly cold winter, not surprising, you rise an awful lot of fossil fuels to stay warm. There's Los Angeles. There's yourselves. Los Angeles' population is about 1/2 of South Pole. So the future is urban. We've already crossed the boundary here globally. China's passed the 50% mark. Africa is about 33% urbanized in terms of population living in cities. It's the next place where you're going to see a massive change in the growth of cities. So if we're going to make a change, now's the time to make the change, because in 30 years' time, when these places are built, they're not subject to a great deal of change. Much of the city that I come from in Dublin was built 200 years ago. It hasn't changed. Even if they replace the buildings, they're about the same dimensions as the old buildings. The roads are remained the same. If you look up a map of London and you look at the Roman roads, they're the same roads that are still in London. Once you put these things down in place, they're very, very hard to disentangle and remake. And this is where the big cities of the planet are going to appear. If you were in Finland or in Western Europe and North America, more and more of them are in tropical climates. And think about the implications for that. Let's say, for example, that the cities of India demand the same level of comfort in buildings as the population of Los Angeles in terms of air conditioning systems. There's not enough energy in the world to provide the same level of air conditioning in these parts of the world that they experience currently in North America. I showed you a picture of Phoenix earlier on. Phoenix is a city of about 1 million people. It's in the middle of a desert. Without access to resources you can take from somewhere else, there's no way Phoenix, Arizona, should exist. And here's the populations of the city, population of the world distributed according, population of cities distributed according to Köppen classification. And you can see more and more of the cities are in the red zone. In the past, all the big cities of the world were all located in the blue area, the Mediterranean climates, which make perfect sense. Seasons, water, more comfortable certainly, but increasingly populations are now located in the A climates. You can see there's very, very few in the D climates and very, very few in the B climates. The only two big cities you see in the B climates are places like Cairo, which sits on the Nile, and the emerging cities in Saudi Arabia like Riyadh, which is a population of about 2 million. But when you have the oil wealth of Riyadh has, well, you can make water. So I think what you're starting to see globally happening is that there's an understanding that the scale at which we attack global climate change maybe needs to change its focus. One of the examples of this is the emergence of the C40 city group and the Mexico City Pact, where mayors of the world actually commit themselves to making changes. Now, I think this is the right scale at which to do changes, because this is a scale where you can influence people's behavior, where you can put codes on buildings, where you can manage transportation patterns. But you're starting to see a shift In North America, for example, where Donald Trump refuses to engage in anything associated with the Paris Agreement, lots of cities in North America are already meeting the goals of the carbon commitments under the Paris Agreement and pushed forward, gone beyond what's required. Even though the nation hasn't done it, cities are. Okay, so what is urban climate science? Well, this is where we live, and this is where we measure. We measure where nobody lives. In fact, if that instrument happens to find itself inside the city, we regard it as contaminated, and we take it out. We don't measure the climates we actually experience. All the climate systems that we have, which are based upon WMO standards, are designed to provide regional scale climates. And the way they do this is they simply standardize exposure. So all these stations should be located over low grass surfaces exposed to about 2 meters height, green surface. And if I add up all this information, I know about the global climate. What it doesn't tell you is about the climate that I actually experience. This is a lovely picture of Dallas taken from above. Again, you can see the organization of the city, the classic central business district. You can see the highway system here, the warehouses, and over here you can see the suburban areas. We don't measure inside these places. And yet this is where everybody is located. We don't measure inside Sao Paulo, even though that's where 20 million people live. We measure the airport. So why don't we measure inside cities? Well, part of the reason is they're extremely hard. Extremely hard to measure because nobody can figure out what is the right site to put an instrument. Now, to some extent, this is changing. It's changing because sensors are getting a lot cheaper, which means you can have a lot more sensors. But the real reason we never put stations inside cities is because they were considered to be heterogeneous. And the whole basis of putting the instruments in place was to look for homogeneity, sameness. So, this is Tokyo. This man is struggling to walk up the street. This man is standing here, complete calmness, looking at him. He's a meter away. Where do I take my wind measurements? Where do I take my measurements about rainfall? This is a Tokyo. This is a river system that's been completely neglected. This New Delhi. The landscape here is completely paved over. You can see the shimmer created by the heating. And this, of course, is Beijing. This poor man is walking with his child. Both of them have a gas mask on as they walk down the street. Urban climates are total, and they affect us. Yet we rarely measure them. What are the climate drivers? Well, if I want to structure and understand the city, the most important idea is the idea of scale. This is the broadest description of the city as a whole. Here's the planetary boundary air. This is the air passing from an area that's natural to an area that's urbanized. And what's happened is the atmosphere has been altered. It's been altered by interaction with the ground. And you can see the effect of the city extends upwards through the atmosphere until eventually it gets to the top of the mixing layer. And then over here we have the air passing over another natural environment. We get another boundary layer, and we have the urban plume extending downwind. These plumes extend for thousands of miles. There was a report of a plume in Europe that was measured where they were able to trace back the gases to New York City. In other words, that single plume coming off New York City affected a continent away. What is it about the city? There's its physical form, its surface cover, its geometry, the fact that we actually create buildings and roughness. And there's the fabric, how we actually construct the city. Then it's how it's occupied. And the occupation of it is largely got to do with the sustaining water, energy, etc. that's required simply to keep the city going. So here's aspects of urban form. There's Hong Kong, extraordinary, right? What you do is put a little top over there and you have a room, a massive room. There's the street. It's like New York in terms of the height of the buildings. The big difference is the streets are tiny, extremely narrow. Air can't flow down these streets. They have to talk about removing signs to allow air to flow along the streets to ventilate the air. This is the fabric. This is the UN building in New York, a slab building. They're usually disastrous, by the way, slab buildings, because The air comes in like this and then pours down the front. This one's shielded completely in glass. And that surface cover, this is Central Park in New York, looks like a big basin. Looks like, if you would see this from a geomorphological point of view, you would say this is effectively a landscape that's collapsed, a bit like a karst landscape. And there's the function. Traffic, which of course is a major source of air quality. Buildings themselves, which are about 1/3 of the sink for energy use inside the city, is taken up with simply managing buildings. This is a very peculiar building in London called the Gherkin. And of course, industry, which includes energy generation. So typically we talk about 1/3 of the energy being used in buildings, about 1/3 in transportation, about 1/3 in industry. Form and function are related. Just to give you an example, this is Atlanta, that's Barcelona, about the same population, but they occupy two entirely different size areas. In order to get around Atlanta, you have to use an awful lot of energy. That means cars. So not surprisingly, they have an enormous amount of output per person, whereas in Barcelona, which is much more densely occupied, far less emissions. Okay, so now let me go through some of those elements. Scale is critical. I showed you this already, but if you took a magnifying glass and looked down to the level which you live, eventually you'd end up at this level here. You have an individual building and the outdoor space. So if you think of all climate as basically a byproduct of our behavior, we fight to create a climate inside buildings that we're comfortable with. We'd like to have a climate outside the building that we're comfortable with, but in creating that climate inside a building, in creating a climate inside our car to motorize ourselves around, we're actually generating CO2. And that CO2 goes up through the atmosphere into the urban plume, but ultimately it begins at this level here. And how we organize the buildings, that's how we get these neighborhoods. So if I could control these sort of things, the types of buildings, the space between the buildings, organize with vegetation to get neighborhoods, eventually I could build up to a city. Now, why do I mention this? It seems to me that if you wanted to tackle climate change, it is the neighborhood level that you have to actually tackle it. Because that's the level at which we all live and occupy. It's the level at which we move around. This is the biggest problem associated with climate science. How do you deal with it? I mean, this is Tokyo. It's unbelievable. 25 million people. Think about the human endeavor that went into producing that. About all the materials that must have been gathered, manufactured, and assembled to make that city. And then think about the climate when viewed from above, passing over such a rough surface, and think about what the climate is like in the individual streets. All your decisions are based upon your occupation inside the street, but the net impact across the entire city generates this type of landscape. Here's the thing about cities, and this is why we have to come up with a proper way of discussing them, is not all cities are the same, and not all parts of the city are the same. This is suburban Chicago. It's extraordinarily green. Now we think, when we see pictures of Chicago, the high-rises, they occupy a tiny fraction of the city of Chicago. Much of the city looks like this. When those trees are in full cover, Chicago is properly classified as a forest. You can see it's completely gridded. It's no wonder you need an enormous amount of carbon dioxide to get around this place because there's no way out. There's no shop nearby. The only way you can get anywhere is by getting in a car. There's no concentration. In other words, this city is basically being constructed around the private car. So that means you've bought into all the consequences. My other favorite picture, this is Cairo. What a picture. All the life, all the cars, all the vehicles, all the people, all the food, all the buildings, with all the windows open, all the air pollution being generated, moving back and forth between the buildings. This is the complexity of the city that we're trying to modify or alter to try and adjust global climate. The thing I've been trying to say is that if we want to try and attack climate change, it has to be at the scale at which we live. And that means we must be fundamentally aware of the geometry of the city and the fact we all live below roof level. This is where cities differ from each other. Different cities occupy different places. And that means they've got different background climates and they're fighting against different types of climates. This is a classic sort of description of how to achieve comfort from an architectural point of view. Along this side here is outdoor air temperature, outside here is humidity. These are the two things that mostly control your indoor comfort. So every building is fighting against the outdoor climate to provide that zone there. What does it mean for a cartoon? Well, you have to reduce the temperature, but you also have to humidify the air. Look what it means for Singapore. First of all, very little variation throughout the year. In order for you to change the climate of Singapore to get to this point here, you have to cool it, and also you have to dry out the air. There's a lovely book about Singapore. It's called Air Conditioned Nation. In other words, they decided, the former king, that for Singapore to be a productive society, they need to have the right climate indoors. So he looked around to find out what was the most productive climate. He decided to Switzerland. So most buildings in Singapore until recently, they provided Switzerland's climate inside. Now, that takes an enormous amount of energy to achieve. There's New Delhi, crosses the boundary. London has to be cooled, warmed. Moscow certainly has to be warmed. That means for me that building energy management is absolutely critical to managing global climate change. So you have to get down to the level where people actually occupy the spaces. Each city is unique, but I'm going to try and look for sort of common features that can be found in every single city. Otherwise, you can't develop a science. This is a beautiful picture of Beijing. It's tried repeatedly to try and control its roads. Every one of these roads represents a new inner ring. Now I think like the 7th inner ring. It's located inside a basin. It gets very cold winters, and recently they were all warmed by having coal fires. Massive industrial production of electricity from coal fires. The consequence was, of course, some of the worst air quality in the world. So, given everything that, given all the problems, how has urban climate science tried to address them? Well, cities are very complicated, so you simply make a pretend city. This is a pretend city built outside of Tokyo. This is called the Kanda Lab. And what Manabu Kanda did here was he decided to replace all the real buildings by these concrete blocks, where you could control everything. All the dimensions of the buildings are the same, and you can control all the separation distances. And then he's an instrument here. Look where it's located, by the way. It's not located in the ground, it's located at height. And the idea was that they could move these around and see what the impact was in the overarching climate. So the only way to actually make progress in this field was, yes, to have observations in individual cities, but you have to theorize. And one way of theorizing was to actually come up with a model of what makes the city. In real cities, this is what we do. If I want to know about the city as a whole, I can't be in amongst the buildings. I have to be way above the buildings. There's an instrument that we put up in Dublin. That's not me. It's about 70 meters above the ground. And this is the instrument that was put up. The instrument measures carbon dioxide, latent heat, sensitivity coming off the landscape. And when you put it up here, the instrument sees a portion of the landscape and is able to record what's happening. So if you're clever about this, you choose different neighborhoods and you make measurements to try and figure out what's happening. And then you try to combine that information with other measurements to make sure that you theoretically are working in the same space. And then you build models. And the models are getting better and better. With Professor Ronaldo's class, I showed the students some of these models today, but some of these models are becoming increasingly sophisticated. Many of them are fully three-dimensional and tell you what's happening inside a building and also what's happening outside the outdoor space. Some of them are a lot simpler. Nevertheless, you're going to have to take it on faith that these models are getting very, very good. So you're able to take global climate models and then put information into the city, into those models, and then tell you what's happening inside a city. These are the key measures by which we describe a city. If you can get this information about a city, then you're well on the way to understanding how that city influences climate and how the climate influences that city. You can see some of the things that we would get normally. Here, for example, is the area occupied by buildings and the area occupied by the entire landscape. And this is very useful because it tells you how much of this space is below roof height. This tells me about the area of vegetation, the total area and the area that's vegetated. This is the area that's impermeable, which happens to be the same as the area that's actually vegetated. Here's the height of buildings and the width of streets, the height-width ratio. It turns out this is one of the most important measures you can get about any given city. Here's the spacing between buildings, building dimensions, the urban structure. In other words, if you can describe the city using these terms, then it's possible to implement these modules. These modules will tell you what's happening inside the building and what's happening in the outdoors. And it all comes back to this idea about structuring our information. So this is what we feel is the best way of structuring it. At the micro scale, it's the facet. This is where you control what's happening in a given space. So if there's a plaza in Sao Paulo that experiences that you expect people to use, but they're not using it, chances are it's because of the nature of the facet. Here we're now at the level of building. Here the buildings come together. Now we have a bit of geometry. Here's a bit of extended geometry. We have a block. Here we have a neighborhood. Here we have the city. So the job is to try and understanding everything from this level up to that level there, so that we can go back in the opposite direction. And here's one of the descriptions that we use. These are local climate zones. They're supposed to be universal. Now, I know there's lots of problems about assigning a local climate zone precisely in any given city, but I can tell you with an absolute fact, this has greatly clarified communication between scientists. Because when someone says to me, oh, I made measurements in a city, the first question I ask is, what type of landscape did you make your measurements over? Did you make your measurements in that type of environment, or did you make it in that type of environment? Chicago, suburb versus Chicago city center. That's the only way I can do the comparison. Otherwise, we're just talking rubbish. They get measurements, I get measurements, they're different from each other. How do I know why they're different? I have to understand the landscape in order to make that knowledge transfer. And here's what we find. It's a very, very simple one. For that book, we took together all the measurements that are made around the planet. Now, they're not made everywhere. In fact, think about it. 3.5 billion people living inside cities. This is the totality of measurements of fluxes measured in cities throughout the world. Many of these are the same city in different places, the same city. We spent we spent money on satellites, we spent money on the ocean, on the landscape. We've not internationally spent a great deal of money trying to figure out how cities function and how they operate. So here's all the measurements. Alongside here is one of those critical variables, the proportion of the landscape that's vegetated. Alongside this axis here is how the energy available in the system is spent. Up here, it's spent on evaporation, cooling the atmosphere. Down here, it's spent on heating the atmosphere, causing the urban heat island. Now here's a very simple measure. If about 50% of the landscape is vegetated, the available energy is split about half between heating up the overlying atmosphere and evaporating water. So the most effective change you can make to a city is to breathe. So let me finish off now by talking about how these might get applied. A lot of the stuff that we see in urban climate science is very, very fractured. And the reason it's fractured, I think, is because there's not a clear link between the process, the scale, and the expected outcome. First of all, you can get the distinction between places that are already built, and therefore can be modified. A phrase that comes to mind is climate rehabilitation. Places that have not yet been built. So if we want to make a big change on the planet right now, it's the cities in Asia that are emerging, the ones in India that are emerging, and the ones in Africa that are emerging. The chance of you changing London is next to zero. You have to wipe it out and start from scratch. So a distinction between that at the beginning. If you can set up standards for new cities, then you have a chance. That means you don't have a lock-in. You don't have types of buildings, you don't have transportation patterns that you deal with. Link the policy explicitly to the outcome. Scale, scale, scale. Dollar for a trade. Know where you are, but also be aware of scale. Try to meet goals simultaneously, because sometimes fixing an urban heat island causes a problem somewhere else. In other words, think about all the outcomes you want that are positive and try to come up with the best compromise to achieve that. Now for me, I think urban design, rather than urban planning, is an optimal scale which to achieve real results. By that I mean the three-dimensional architecture view of the city, I think, is the key scale which to examine. So some examples, as only the Germans can do. This is Freiburg. What they've done is they've organised the buildings here. The buildings are the same height, so they all have access to sunshine. They don't steal each other's sunshine. Here's the equivalent in London. It's called Wellington Zero Energy Development. And again, each of those buildings have their own individual ventilation shafts up here. They also have solar panels, and they have windows on one side. And the individuals in the house are supposed to go back and forth between the sunshine and the darkened areas. In other words, they adjust their behavior. This is the Malaysia camera facility. It's got the classic sort of design to make access to the sun, but they've vegetated one entire side. And sometimes the most beautiful solutions have already been come up with. Arcades in a hot climate are absolutely incredibly good design for the climate they occupy because they provide shade and provide ventilation. Importance of scale. London, which has the money, of course, has a problem. The River Thames floods because it gets too much rainwater, but it floods because it gets too much ocean water. Their solution is the barrier. The barrier simply raises or shuts itself to protect the city. That's its answer to resilience. There's not many cities in the world that can afford to do this. Bangladesh certainly can't afford to do it. Here's an American sustainable building. This is a Walmart. First of all, notice that it's in the middle of nowhere. Everybody has to drive it. The building has a white rooftop because that's good because it rejects energy, but also has black tiles on it because that's photovoltaic. In other words, the building itself is big and flat because that means there's no stairs, so it's all about storage. But look at what is needed to sustain it. Is it right to simply draw the boundary around the building and say it's sustainable without considering the fact that every one of these cars represented a trip from somewhere there to get there? I think scale is critical. Yes, that building is sustainable, but so what? It's fundamentally not in a sustainable location. Design. This actually comes from Dublin. Those are not for shade. They're to stop rainfall. They are upturned umbrellas, so the water goes into the centre and then feeds into the ground to make the space occupiable. Dublin, although it's quite cool, never actually gets very cold. So if you can actually make a space that's actually usable by making sure you don't get wet, suddenly you have a usable outdoor space. And of course, if people are outdoors, that means not indoors. This is a climate change action. Part of Germany, trees, the most effective design tool by a long shot. Trees provide shade, they provide shelter. They also do a host of other things in terms of consuming air pollutants are in the atmosphere. This is almost like a design after the fact. These are very tall buildings either side. The big slab buildings is the city of Edmonton. If you want to get planning permission for a city in the middle of Edmonton, you have to connect yourself to every other building. So you can walk through the entire downtown and never go outdoors. You can just go from one building to another through these umbilical cords that connect every single building. If you are outdoors, however, in the summertime, then these big buildings they put up cause all sorts of wind problems. So what they've done here is they've built artificial trees with those canopies up there, and they're designed not to provide shade, but they're designed to block the wind coming down the front of the building and cause misery for people outdoors. How about this for a beautiful design? This is Mallorca. We're used to shades associated with individual buildings. So here they put something very simple, a canopy that covers the entire street. Suddenly it's an outdoor/indoor environment, protected from the sunshine, perfectly usable throughout the day. Depending on the climate, water or vegetation can be equally effective in terms of modifying climate. This is a famous river in South Korea, in Seoul. They removed the old river, which was only a freeway, and they replaced it with this. This is part of France. Use the outdoor space, the plazas, and water to offer cooling opportunities. If you can't afford this, but this is what you often also see in France, tiny little sprays on each street, atomizing the water, maximizing cooling, providing cool spaces adjacent to the shop. You also have a shaving. This is a famous building in London. This is Barbican, very similar to the buildings I see around here. Brutalist architecture. And actually, it's actually quite nice inside. They have this lovely mixture of vegetation and water, keep the space very nice. And more than anything else, vegetation. Trees especially, because trees give you architecture that you don't get with grass. Trees can be planted inside hard fabric. Some examples from France where they're actually growing almost wild margins. This is from Sweden, where they managed to keep the traffic on either side. You walk down the centre. Generally speaking, you find that the worst air quality is always when you're very close to a street. So they use the trees effectively to provide a pathway down the street, but also protect you from traffic on either side. Or here in Milan, the railway track is also grass verge. It's also got trees. There's an equivalent in Singapore. So if those are all micro-scale designs, how typically do they get integrated? Here's one example. Here's the Urban Climate Map book. This is Hong Kong. The first thing they did was map out the climate. That's what they're doing here. Now they mapped out the climate, so you can see clearly where they live in Hong Kong. It's actually a very green city, if you consider the island. So all the building actually happens on the margins. So they identify all the areas, like near the old airport, there's the port, that they need to focus their attention on. And the way they do their design is they look at the city in relation to the landscape that surrounds it. The idea is they take from Germany. Stuttgart is a very, very famous school of landscape architecture, linked to geography, linked to climate. Here's the city of Stuttgart, so they've mapped out the entire city. And all these little arrows you see here represent what they regard as the natural ventilation roots into the city. Stuttgart started this in 1930 because it's such a bad air quality problem that rather than trying to move the industry, what they decided to do was move the air. So they looked at all the ventilation paths that allowed the air to move out of the city. But now they actually incorporate it into their climate design. So where's all this leading? Well, what you're starting to see is a closing of the gap between global climate science and urban climate science. And especially what you're starting to see is very large cities now are taking on the task of actually measuring inside the city. This is the example of Shanghai, which has its own meteorological center specifically for Shanghai. So that's all it does. It does air quality, weather, everything you need just for Shanghai. And the idea is that they get measurements inside the city itself using all sorts of simple devices, including, for example, crowdsource information, and they incorporate it. So these are the steps that are being taken right now. And the WMO is actually sponsoring this as a major initiative to make cities more resilient. So, I'm going to conclude now. I think about climate change a bit like an Irish signpost. They give you directions to everything, but very, very hard to get any information on it. Lots of data, no information. Urban climate science is maturing into a real science, and that means it has an opportunity to converge global climate science. I think the challenge we face now is to evaluate and to transfer knowledge between places. If I was to say there was one big problem associated with urban climate science is the almost complete absence of information about most cities on the planet. So even though the models are very good, I can't run the models because I don't have the data. And that's our problem, I think. This is Buckminster Fuller's view of what you might be able to do in New York. The idea was that every city could effectively look after its own climate, put a big dome over Manhattan, and he figured that he could save Manhattan all the cost of clearing up snow by simply putting a dome over the city and creating its own climate. I fear that if every city just goes on this path here, you're going to see the Londons and the New Yorks of the world, the Los Angeles of the world, be able to look after themselves. But the Dhakas of the world, the New Delhis of the world, I'm afraid, will be left the consequence of climate change. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Professor. Nos vamos a abrir un poquito una sesión de preguntas, que ainda temos um tempinho, até que aproximar a conversa de 25 minutos. E depois o professor Emerson gostaria de fazer uma round-up. Então, perguntas, por favor, e se alguém quiser fazer em português, eu faço a tradução.
Yes, well, first I'd like to thank you very much for your very inspiring talk. I've been studying urban climate for quite a while, and I was wondering, I had taken several notes, but one thing that called my attention is that you were talking about how we measured some climate that we do not experience in the city, right? So I work with air quality myself, and I've been working with modeling a lot, but concerning the observations of air quality, the World Health Organization, they have different standards for measuring air quality. So we have, for example, monitoring sites which are located on the street, monitoring sites which are located in the neighborhood, and then urban background. So we have like different spatial representativeness of each data. So these are in the rules of the WHO.
Yeah.
So I mean, do you consider that it would be possible to somehow translate these, different categories of exposure to air pollution into exposure of weather or climate or temperature or any other atmospheric variables? Maybe the World Meteorological Organization and the World Health Organization could, try to find a common ground. I don't know what.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think that air pollution meteorology had made many of the advances in urban climate science long before the climatologists had, mainly because of the good description of the urban landscape. Here's the thing I find about air quality measurements, and I find it in Ireland and the European countries, is that the air quality people don't measure weather. All they measure is how much stuff is in the air. Now, I cannot figure out why this is so hard to do. So I know that the air is bad, but I know nothing about meteorology to be able to interpret it. So it's the one thing I can never figure out about the air quality measurements. You're right, they make these choices about where to locate them. And often they do two things. They establish a background network, and then they move instruments to sites where they think there are hotspots. But for the life of me, I cannot understand why the air quality measurements don't require weather measurements. And here's the other thing I don't understand, and it's part of what's happening that the WMO is trying to push, is that the services that are responsible often for managing air quality are not the same services required that are dealing with weather. In other words, they're two different organizations. It gets worse. The organization that measures the water levels in rivers hardly ever measure precipitation. We have this entirely blinkered approach to acquiring information about the environment. The air quality people tell me about the state of the air, but they can't tell me about how it got there. The weather people measure at the airport and tell you about the temperature and wind velocity. They measure the rainfall. Then they give the rainfall to the hydrology people, because the hydrology people don't measure the rainfall. So you have a mismatch between where the rainfall is measured and where the catchments are. So you have a mismatch between where we're measuring the air quality and where we're getting the weather data from. So in order for you to run the air quality models, we benchmark them against your ability to predict the air quality status. But then you have to go off the weather station where the stuff was never measured to get the air quality, the meteorology data to feed into the model to understand the result. It's incomprehensible. If you were to have a comprehensive environmental system based upon cities, which is where most people live, you'd set up the environmental monitoring system just as you say, and you would acquire everything simultaneously. Whereas I don't think the WMO are necessarily going to make adjustments. What you're going to see is individual cities are going to set up their own integrated urban services that will connect air quality, will connect weather, will connect hydrology. What you're also going to see happen is you're going to see increasingly people incorporating crowdsourced data into the system. Now, I didn't realize the extent of this until I was at an experiment. We took information for Paris. In Paris, they have 800 national weather stations. 800. There's only one official weather station for Paris. So when I'm looking at things like heat wave deaths, and remember 30,000 people died in 2003, most of them died in the big cities, then it's going to be the crowdsourced data that's going to provide a lot of information. So I think we're in a revolutionary period in terms of exchanges. I think the air quality's big issue for me is, up until now, we've been measuring ambient air quality from the status point of view. The real key will be to figure out dosage. to move from exposure to dosage. And that's a real challenge. And that's again where I see the personal monitors, the sensors, really playing a big role in the future. But what you point out is absolutely right. Yes.
Thank you very much, Professor. Acho que melhor o Emerson.
Sorry, tem algo de traduzir para mim, por favor.
I'm going to translate.
Uma dúvida com relação à medida em si, né? O Brasil tem passado por um momento de mudança da rede de estação meteorológica automática, da convencional para a automática.
Você não quer traduzir que você está mais ligado à questão climática?
A dúvida que a gente está tendo é, será que as estações automáticas têm a mesma confiabilidade que as estações convencionais? Está tendo uma ruptura, né? A gente tem séries históricas que são das convencionais, e agora a gente entrou com as estações automáticas. Então,
Dá uma chance para
essa é a nossa...
Yeah. Gerald, he asked me to
Yep.
translate. Professor Emerson Gavani is asking because here in Brazil we mostly use, have been using in the past until now manual measurements, and now we're transitioning to automatic measurements. So there is a gap between these time series of manual to automatic, and then we'll have already consolidated methods of measuring the manually managed monitors. So how do we do that? I mean, it's quite a challenge. How are we certain that the automatic monitoring will be as good quality as the manual monitoring? How do we make this transition in the best way possible?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, what you'd say is an issue you run both systems together and you calibrate so that you make sure that one thing is the same as the other. From the records I've seen inside cities, a lot of the records already have a very big jumps in them associated with changes in instrumentation, or worse yet, changes in location. So for me, the key thing is to have metadata, descriptions about the site that are constantly maintained about the instrumentation. That's what I think. I think the big loss when we lose on the manual is going to lose all the visuals. We're going to lose the cloud cover. We're going to lose the visibility stuff. Because the ability to identify different types of clouds, that will all be gone. So for me, that will be the big loss when we move away from manual. So there's no doubt about it. Quality control will require vigilance. And that means calibration.
Você quer traduzir atrás pouquinho? Okay.
By the way, this was the, I was trying to show you earlier on. This is the city center of Sao Paulo. As you go through the daytime, what you're watching is the shadows across the city. And all the data is already there to do it, and the models are there. You can see it pass by noon, the afternoon, then the evening. Right. So there's lots of stuff out there that can help you understand how cities affect climate at a very basic level.
Emerson, você não quer realizar a sala?
Eu acho que é só agradecer ao professor. Nosso departamento tem 2 programas de pós-graduação que a sua vinda vai fazer uma conexão, né, entre esses 2 programas. Tem lacunas de conhecimento da climatologia que envolve tanto a geografia humana quanto a geografia física.
He thanks you very much because he thinks that your role here is very important for us, for geography, because we have 2 programs, the physical geography program and the human geography program. So, we have, in fact, we have lagoons, we have spots of no knowledge.
Well, this is the same issue we have in Dublin.
Yes.
I always say that the division between human and physical geography is a fraud. That you can't understand physical geography if you don't take into account humans, because they're part of nature. So you can't ignore them. I think cities are a very good way to see the relationship between the two, because everything you see about the city is a product of politics, construction, everything, corruption, everything is there. So we get a climate as a consequence. So I think it's a good way of talking, it's a shared space. I think, studying the climates of cities. They're approachable, you can do walks in them, you can discover the climate yourself. And I think it's fundamentally, because ultimately when we talk about climate change, I mean, we hear about all the disasters, and I'm sure there will be disasters, but the planet will go on. There might be no humans, but the planet will go on. So it seems to me that you are going to have to talk about physical and geography, human geography together, because separate makes no sense. No sense at all.
Muito obrigado.